Did you know that inhaling polluted air could lead to type 2 diabetes? A new landmark study, the first of its kind in India, has followed more than 12,000 men and women in Delhi and Chennai between 2010 and 2017 and repeatedly measured their blood sugar levels. The scientists used satellite data and air pollution exposure models to determine the pollution levels for each participant's locality, and the findings are staggering. 1 month of exposure to PM 2.5 led to an increase in blood sugar levels, and with exposure of 1 year or more, an increased risk of diabetes. For every 10 microgram per meter cube increase in annual average PM 2.5 levels in the two cities, the risk for diabetes increased by 22 or 23%.
Interestingly, we found the similar kind of effect in both cities, although we did the analysis separately. And that indicates that within these kind of urban environments, if you have these kind of high levels of pollution, you are increasing the risk of diabetes by around 22 to 23% in long term. So that was the major finding. Additionally, we also looked at subgroups. So, for example, people with hypertension would probably have a higher risk of developing diabetes, and that was true. That was true in Chennai, but not in Delhi. So obviously, I mean, there are city-specific differences, both in terms of the exposure. So PM 2.5 everywhere is not the same. So although we measure it using a concentration, the composition of PM 2.5 is very different in different cities, and also within a city it can vary. And also the population structure is also different in these cities. So we found that a younger population was more affected in Delhi, and a hypertensive population was developing more diabetes in Chennai.
While the latest study that the group has published, based on their research with this Delhi and Chennai cohort, focuses on diabetes, they have previously published similar findings on air pollution and its link to increased blood pressure and hypertension with the same cohort. The evidence indicates that PM 2.5 affects insulin production and disrupts the functioning of the endocrine system, which produces the body's hormones. This means that pollution may have a role to play in the increased instances of not just diabetes, but diseases like hypothyroidism, polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS, and gestational diabetes. But how exactly does this work?
Particulate matter or PM 2.5, when you inhale it, it goes directly into your lungs. And from the lungs, since the particle matter is the size is so small, it can cross the blood barrier. It can go into your blood. Once it goes into the blood and also in the lungs, it can create inflammation in the lungs. And there's something called an endothelial tissue layer, which covers most of the tissues, or it's even in the lungs. So it causes inflammation mostly. So inflammation and oxidative stress are two of the major ways or pathways through which PM 2.5 can affect these bunch of different diseases. So the common mechanism is through inflammation and oxidative stress. There's a second mechanism, which is, so if you think of your heartbeats, your heartbeat is not a voluntary action. So for example, if I move my hand, that's a voluntary action, but I cannot control my heartbeat. So that's controlled by something called an involuntary system, or it's also called as an autonomic nervous system. So PM 2.5 can affect this imbalance between in the autonomic nervous system, which gives rise to problems in the heart. So for example, arrhythmias, or any kind of heart related problems. This is through the autonomic nervous system. The tissue inflammations, which is one of the hypothesized causes for diabetes, that is also caused by PM 2.5. So these are two or three different mechanisms through which PM 2.5 can affect endocrine systems, and also it can affect your fat deposition in tissues, which is another possible risk factor for developing diabetes.
There's been a lot of talk lately about the impact of air pollution on respiratory functions, and policymakers have put in seasonal guidelines to address this effect. However, scientists call for a longer-term, holistic approach with this new knowledge in mind.
The first thing is to acknowledge air pollution as a long term problem rather than just doing some knee jerk reactions in, let's say, specific seasons. Also, it's not like if you have low pollution, for example, in Chennai, it doesn't mean that you don't have a problem in terms of health. In fact, in the US or the European countries, the concentrations are even lower, and even then you see problems. So there's no, it's not like you have a safe limit somewhere. So we need to acknowledge that fact first. So that is a year long problem. And also the issue that it's not only restricted to Delhi, for example. It's not that Delhi has all the air pollution and other cities don't. It's a very important thing to acknowledge that a lot of tier 2 cities which have a large amount of pollution, it also has a dense population which is affected. So the burden of disease is not necessarily going to be restricted to a few cities. It has to be across the country. So the actions against air pollution also has to be across the country. So at the individual level, I think we are talking about ambient air pollution. Individual level exposure you can reduce using, let's say, masks or air purifiers, but that's not going to be enough because the air pollution is going to stay outside your home. And once you go outside or once you open your windows, they will affect health outcomes.
Some people, especially those with comorbidities, are likely to be more prone to these effects.
So, for example, if you have hypertension, it's more likely that you will be affected by air pollution. But there are certain things which are, which I mean, epidemiological studies have shown, but it's not common knowledge. So, for example, people with other vulnerabilities, so let's say socioeconomically poorer sections of the community, they would have a larger effect, for example. And the reason is, so for example, socioeconomically poor neighborhoods probably have are likely to have more air pollution, but they also have, let's say, poor diet. So if you have a poor diet in conjunction with high air pollution, that is sort of an interactive effect which gives rise to a higher risk of other chronic diseases. So there are vulnerable populations in the country which are going to be more affected by air pollution. I think that that's important.
What would you like us to talk about next? Tell us in the comments.